The rain had begun softly that evening, like a delicate whisper from the sky. Ethan stood at the corner of the cafe, watching the droplets collide with the pavement, forming ripples that seemed to mimic the unspoken tension between his thoughts and emotions. The city, despite its usual chaotic pace, seemed to pause in reverence to the rhythmic patter of the rain. The world outside felt distant, muted. He walked inside to escape the wetness and the chill, seeking solace in the warm embrace of the cafe's dim lighting. As he made his way through the entrance, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloped him, comforting and familiar. The cafe was small, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city that most people overlooked, but it was his favorite place to think. His feet instinctively led him to his usual corner, where the soft hum of the espresso machine and the faint murmur of conversations formed the perfect soundtrack for contemplation. And then he saw her. Ava was sitting by the window, her dark, curly hair cascading down her shoulders, her eyes focused on the pages of a photography magazine. She looked unaware of everything around her, lost in the world of art and creativity. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice him at first. But to Ethan, it felt as though the world had shifted, that time had slowed down, and all that existed in that moment was her. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether he should approach her. There was something about her that drew him in, something familiar yet mysterious. Her presence, even in her quiet solitude, seemed to have an undeniable pull. He stood there, feeling the weight of his own hesitations pressing down on him. Finally, he made his way over to her table. He cleared his throat softly, and she looked up from the magazine, startled for a brief second, her eyes wide with surprise. "Hi," Ethan said, his voice calm but laced with a nervous energy he couldn't hide. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I couldn't help but notice. You're a photographer, aren't you?" Ava blinked, her initial surprise giving way to curiosity. She glanced at him, studying his face for a moment before nodding. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice soft and smooth, like the rain outside. "I work freelance mostly, just trying to capture moments that speak to me, I guess." There was a pause, a silence that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Ethan couldn't quite understand why he felt such an intense connection to this woman in just the few moments they had shared. There was something about the way she spoke, the calmness in her demeanor, and the way her eyes shimmered with an almost unspoken depth that intrigued him. "I'm Ethan," he said, offering his hand. "I'm a writer, just trying to figure out the next chapter in my life." Ava smiled, shaking his hand briefly. "A writer? That's interesting. What kind of things do you write about?" Ethan shrugged, settling into the seat across from her. "Mostly fiction, stories about people trying to figure themselves out. You know, the usual stuff. Identity, love, loss. I suppose I'm trying to make sense of it all." The words felt oddly familiar as they left his mouth, as though he had said them 1,000 times before, but never quite like this. With her, it felt different, as if there was a deeper understanding waiting to unfold between them. Ava raised an eyebrow slightly, intrigued. "Sounds like you're searching for something. Are you finding it?" Ethan's gaze drifted away for a moment, his mind catching on to the familiar ache he had been pushing down for so long. "I don't know," he confessed. "Maybe I'm afraid that if I find it, it'll slip away just as quickly as I discovered it." Her eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly, folding her arms over the table. I think everyone feels that way. But maybe that's why we keep looking, right? To see if we can hold on to something that feels real. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of her words settling between them. There was a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the loneliness they both carried, though neither of them spoke it aloud. It was then that Ava noticed the notebook in Ethan's hand, a worn leather cover, its edges frayed from years of use. "Is that your journal?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Ethan looked down at the notebook, as though it had just dawned on him that he had been clutching it tightly. "It's more than a journal, actually," he said with a slight smile. "It's where I write everything. Ideas, stories, snippets of things I see or feel. Sometimes it's more like a record of everything I'm afraid I'll forget." Ava tilted her head, considering his words. "You write everything? That's a lot to carry around in one place." Ethan nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Yeah, it can be. But it's also where I go when I don't know what to do with all the chaos inside my head. I'm not always sure if the stories are mine to tell, but I write them anyway." There was something about Ava's calm, quiet presence that made him feel like he could say things he hadn't admitted to anyone else. Her understanding, though unspoken, was as much a part of her as her art, and it felt like a safe space for him to exist in that moment. "I can't imagine carrying that weight around," she said softly, almost to herself. "But I guess we all carry something, don't we?" Ethan smiled, his heart aching slightly at the depth of her words. "We do. Sometimes I think it's all just a matter of finding a way to carry it without it breaking us." Ava didn't respond immediately, her eyes drifting to the window as the rain intensified outside, tapping against the glass like a slow heartbeat. There was a quiet vulnerability in her, something she hadn't yet shared. But Ethan could see it in the way she held her camera, the way she spoke about her work, the weight of a life that had been shaped by loss, by beauty, and by moments that slipped through her fingers like grains of sand. "I think we're all just looking for a way to make sense of it all," Ava said after a long pause, her gaze meeting his once more. "Trying to capture the fleeting things, trying to make them last." Ethan nodded, feeling a connection between them that he couldn't quite explain. "Maybe that's why we meet people," he said quietly, almost to himself, "to make sense of it." Ava smiled softly, the kind of smile that held a depth of emotion, one that spoke of experiences shared and understood. Maybe. But sometimes it's not about making sense of everything. Sometimes it's about letting go. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of her words sinking in, the quiet wisdom in her voice ringing louder than any of his own thoughts. And as he sat there, the cafe around them fading into the background, he realized that in that moment, amidst the rain and the shared silence, he wasn't just talking to her. He was learning something he had been too afraid to confront on his own. Perhaps this was what he had been searching for. Not just a story, but a person who could make sense of the chaos in his heart. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something more. But like all things beautiful, it wasn't going to last forever. Years had passed since that evening in the cafe, but to Ethan, it felt like only yesterday that Ava had been sitting across from him, her eyes soft with understanding, her voice like a gentle melody in his ears. Yet now, the quiet space between them had grown vast, stretching further with every passing day. His life had moved on, as had hers. But even the busiest days, the loudest moments, couldn't drown the echo of the time they had shared. Ethan's career had soared. The book he had written all those years ago, inspired by fleeting moments and ephemeral connections, became a bestseller. He was invited to speak at literary festivals, his name printed in magazines, his face on billboards. His life had become a whirlwind of deadlines, interviews, and photo shoots. Yet, beneath it all, there was always an emptiness that couldn't be filled by success or accolades. No matter how many awards he received, or how many people cheered his name, it never quieted the longing he felt for Ava. He had tried to move forward, tried to forget her, or at least push her memory into a corner of his heart. But there were times when he would walk down a street, and the scent of rain on the pavement would make him stop, his mind racing back to that moment in the cafe. Other times, when he sat alone in his apartment late at night, the silence would be too loud, and the ghosts of his past would haunt him, their faces fading but never fully gone. Ava, too, had continued her journey. She had traveled the world, camera in hand, capturing the fleeting beauty of the moments that most people overlooked. Her photos graced the covers of magazines, and her work was displayed in galleries, admired by those who appreciated the stories she told through her lens. Yet, despite all the recognition, there was always a part of her that remained untouched. She had found success, but there were nights when the hollow ache of loneliness settled over her, just as it had for Ethan. She had met others, men who tried to fill the spaces that Ethan had left behind, but none of them felt right. There was always something missing, a part of her heart that she had left behind in that cafe, with him. She often wondered if she would ever find someone who could make her feel the way he had, someone who could see beyond the surface and understand the complexities of her soul. But as time passed, she began to accept that maybe that kind of love was rare. Maybe it was something that only happened once in a lifetime. And then, one fateful day, their worlds collided once again. It was a cold, cloudy morning in Paris when their paths crossed for the second time. Ethan had been invited to a book signing event, one that had attracted thousands of fans from across the world. He had become a symbol of success, a writer whose words resonated with so many. But as he stood at the front of the room, signing book after book, his thoughts kept drifting. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was as if, in the midst of all the applause, he could still hear her voice in the back of his mind, asking him if he had truly found what he was searching for. It was during a brief break in the event that he saw her. She was standing near the entrance, her dark curls framing her face as she stood beside a photographer, holding a camera to her eye. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized her instantly. Avenue, her presence was like a spark, a flash of recognition that sent a rush of memories flooding back. He had not seen her in years, and yet, in that moment, it felt as though no time had passed at all. She was older now, her features more refined, but the essence of who she was, the woman he had loved, was still there. His breath caught in his throat as their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the world had slowed down, as if time itself had paused to allow them this one fleeting moment of connection. Then, as if on instinct, Ethan began to walk toward her. Ava saw him approaching, and for a moment, she froze. Her heart raced, the sound of it loud in her chest as she fought to steady her breathing. She had spent years trying to forget him, trying to erase the part of her that still longed for him. But standing there, seeing him in the flesh again, all of that effort seemed pointless. Ethan stopped a few feet away from her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ava," he said, as though speaking her name was an admission of something he had been denying for far too long. "Ava," he repeated, this time louder, more certain. I can't believe it's really you." Ava's mouth went dry, her eyes unable to leave his. The years had passed, but the feelings were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. She smiled, but it was sad, tinged with the weight of everything that had come before. "I didn't think I'd see you again," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Not like this." Ethan nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I didn't either," he said quietly, "but here we are." There was a moment of silence, the noise of the event fading into the background as they stood there, just looking at each other. Neither of them knew what to say. What words could possibly capture the gravity of everything they had once shared and everything they had lost? Ava broke the silence first, her voice soft but firm. "I'm glad to see you, Ethan. I really am. But I don't know what this means, or if it even means anything anymore." Ethan's heart sank at her words, but he forced himself to smile. "I know. It's just strange, seeing you here after all this time." She nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the camera strap around her neck. "I never forgot you, you know. But I had to keep going, had to keep living my life. It's the only thing I could do." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. "Me too. I tried, Ava. I tried to forget. But the truth is, I don't know if I ever really did." There was another silence, this one heavier, filled with all the things they could never say. Finally, Ava spoke again. "You know, sometimes I think we weren't meant to be. Maybe that love was a beautiful, fleeting thing, something we both needed, but not something that could last forever." Ethan's face softened at her words, the pain of the truth sinking in deeper than he expected. "I don't think it was ever meant to last forever," he said quietly. "But I'll always carry it with me, Ava. Always." Ava smiled faintly, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye. "So will I." And with that, they said goodbye, once again. They didn't kiss, didn't hold on to the past. They simply exchanged one last lingering look, a momentary promise that the love they once shared would remain in their hearts, even if their paths had irrevocably diverged. As Ethan watched Ava disappear into the crowd, he felt a bittersweet relief wash over him. He had seen her again, and while the ache would remain, he knew that this time it was truly the end.